In lecture 3, we're going to introduce a new type of market failure, which is going to be an externality. And an externality, I really want you to look at the first part of that word, external. And we're going to see that externalities have to do with people who aren't part of the market transaction. They're not the buyer, they're not the seller, but they still feel the effect of the market transaction, either the consumption or the production of that good. Good. And so the technical term for externality are the side effects borne by people who are not directly involved in market exchanges. So they're not the buyer, they're not the seller, but there's some sort of side effect from this consumption or production that's influencing people who aren't part of the transaction. And so one side could be the benefit. So there are external benefits or positive side effects from ordinary economic activities. And we call these positive externalities. Positive externalities are going to be benefits to somebody who is not the buyer, they're not the seller, but there's a benefit to somebody else in the market who has no effect on the transaction. Okay, and so let's say that a new neighbor moves next door and fixes up the house. So you were living in a house and the house next door was dilapidated. The grass was really high. There were probably things living in the grass there, and it was just very unsightly. A new neighbor purchases a house and fixes up the house. All of a sudden, that improves your property values. And better neighbor next door improves your property value. So in reality, you should have been willing to give that new neighbor, some money to fix up the house. And so there was a benefit. You weren't the buyer of that house. You had nothing to do with them fixing up the house. You weren't the contractor who was actually doing the fixing up of the house. You were not part of that transaction at all, but you received a benefit. And in reality, you should have been willing to pay. Let's say your house improves in value even $500. You should have been willing to pay him $200 to help fix up his house. And so there's an external benefit, and we're not seeing the full benefit based on alone that market transaction. But on the other side, there are external costs. So sometimes those side effects are negative. So when we have a negative side effect, we call that a negative externality. So external benefit is a positive externality, and external cost is a negative externality. So you might see either one of those terms, or instead of externality, you might see the word spillover. Spillover meaning the same thing, those side effects that aren't side effects by people who aren't involved in those market transactions directly. Okay, so an example would be that pollution one that we looked at. So I'm not consuming whatever this factory is producing. I'm not the producer of this product, but this factory is dumping pollution into Lake Murray, and now I have to deal with it. I usually like to boat on Lake Murray. I like to go swimming, but now I can't, or I don't want to, or it's not as fun to me because there's this negative cost of pollution. And so when we have this negative externality, it's costing society something. We're not feeling the full cost of the production of this good. Even if I'm not a consumer, even if I'm not a producer, I still feel a negative cost. And that cost isn't represented by our supply and demand curve. All right, so let's look at how these actually work in our supply and demand diagram. Okay, so slot A, let's focus on our negative externality first. So our negative externality, there's some sort of missing cost to society that's not represented in our normal supply and demand curve. So we have our normal supply and demand curve. Our economy is currently producing QE output. Okay, so we're operating at point C and we're producing QE. But the full cost to society is not being realized, right? You don't want to swim in a dirty lake. I don't want to boat on a dirty lake. And so there's not the full cost of society. And if that firm had to feel the full cost, it would increase their cost of production, or we can think of it as an input cost would go up. And when that happens, we know we shift that supply curve to the left, and that increases the cost of society. And so ST actually represents that full cost to society. And so the optimal QO is going to be the socially optimal quantity that should be produced. So A is the actual equilibrium. So C is what happens in our market, but A is where we should be. And so if what we can see here is we're operating at C. If we realized the full cost to society, we would actually be at point B, but we know point B isn't where we would remain because it's not in an intersection between a supply and demand curve. And as the cost goes up, we know that we're going to start to see some of those market participants leave, and that's what's going to move us back. It's going to start to reduce that over allocation of resources. And so A is where we should be, C is where we are. We're producing too much of a product. When we have a negative externality, there's an over allocation of resources. We're spending too much of our scarce land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability on the production of this good. Our socially optimal level is less than the quantity that's actually being produced. And so we see that there's a loss to society, and that loss to society is represented by that tannish colored triangle that you see between A, B, C. Okay? So there's that loss of society because we're producing too much. Our scarce resources are over allocated towards the production of this good. All right, so let's move on to our positive externalities. So our positive externality starts out the same way. So we start out with our normal supply and demand curve, and we're operating in this case at, it's called point X with a quantity of E. But there's an extra benefit to society. So I should be willing and able to pay, or maybe not able, but I should be willing to pay my neighbor $200 to fix up his house. If he had that extra $200, he'd demand more fixing up his house, right? And so our demand curve should actually be shifted to the right. And so we should experience that increased demand. And so it's not that we should be operating at point X, we should actually be operating at point Z. And at point Z, what we see is that the optimal quantity is higher than what it was at quantity E. Right now, with our positive externality, we're under allocating resources from our socially optimal quantity. We're under allocating our scarce land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. There's an under allocation of these resources, and so we as a society then should be producing more of these because our demand curve does not accurately reflect the willingness and ability of all consumers in the economy to pay. And so with our negative externality, we have an overallocation. We're producing too much. The socially optimal level is less than the quantity that's currently being produced. But the positive externality, our current quantity is less than the quantity that's socially optimal. There's an under allocation of resources. All right, these graphs can look confusing at first sight. I understand that, but make sure you just look and think about, okay, if my neighbor were to give me $200 more because he has a benefit, then we know that's going to increase demand. Or if I actually had to properly dispose of my waste, it would cost my firm more, and so it would increase it would increase my cost to supply, and that would decrease the quantity I'd supply or shift it to the left. Again, remember, the supply and demand curves kind of look like up and down rather than left and right, so make sure that you make those clear distinctions there. All right, so both our public goods and our externalities lead to inefficient allocations of resources. In the case of a public good, it's very similar to those positive externalities in that we're under allocating our resources. Our negative externality, there's an over allocation of resources. Externalities are those unintended side effects of market activities. So somebody who's not a market participant, they're not the buyer, they're not the seller, they're still somehow affected by that market transaction. On the other hand, a public good is going to be a good that's not rival and not excludable. Okay. Public goods are underallocated, and they're those goods that are shared by all individuals because we cannot exclude people from those goods. All right, again, governments can help intervene. So most common with those public goods, we're going to be government stepping in and actually providing that. But they could also provide a subsidy. In an attempt to correct a negative externality, what we're going to see is first they could define property rights. If somebody owns owns the entire cost, then it's going to internalize that cost, and it'll make their supply curve accurately reflect that cost. So if we actually define those property rights, it's a little bit more difficult in terms of pollution. But if we thought about something like the river or a lake near me or a small pond, if I owned that pond, I'd be less likely to pollute in it if I knew I could earn an income from supplying, for providing recreational activities at a cost or at a price to other people. Taxes is going to be a very common way to deal with externalities. And we're going to talk about taxes in terms of those pollution items in just a minute, but we can help improve the market outcome, help push us towards the actual social optimal equilibrium when we have a negative externality by implementing a specific tax. And so we're going to talk about those in our next lecture when government intervenes in market failures. There can also be direct control. The government can say, you can't pollute, which is also very common. There is no pollution allowed, or you can only pollute X amount. Liability rules and lawsuits, and I'm not sure, you should definitely Google it, but one negative externality deals with Christmas lights and Christmas music and during the holiday season. So we've all seen those massive Christmas displays that light up the whole neighborhood. Well, one neighbor actually sued another neighbor based on this, saying that it was keeping him up at night or giving him headaches. I didn't get the whole story, or I don't remember the whole story off the top of my head, but liabilities and lawsuits, who owns the night? Who owns a good night's rest? Or who owns the right to have a huge display even though it might disrupt your neighbor's sleep? So he wasn't the purchaser of those Christmas lights. The neighbor wasn't the buyer of those Christmas lights. He wasn't the supplier, but he felt the side effects of somebody buying those Christmas lights. When we think about pollution, again, we can use a per unit emission tax, and that's what we're going to look at specifically in our next lecture, is those per unit taxes that we introduced in our previous module. We're going to apply those to a government or a market failure to see how government intervention can actually help improve an economy, improve a market outcome. And then another option, which is also popular in some areas, is tradable emissions permits. So partly that direct control, the government decides how much pollution is a safe amount of pollution or an optimal amount of pollution, and then they provide that many permits. Companies are allowed to trade those permits so that the given amount of pollution is set. In terms of correcting a positive externality, the government can subsidize this, and this is where we might see something like flu shots or healthcare come in. There's positive externalities for everyone in society if we're healthy, right? We don't want people sneezing on us and all of those different items. So the government may step in and provide a subsidy to encourage people to take advantage of some sort of health benefit. The government can also provide a good that has a positive externality. But what we often see are goods that have positive externalities are more likely to be subsidized, whereas our public goods are more likely to be government provided. That's not always the case, but typically more than likely. Tax refunds and deductions are very similar to subsidies in that it's giving a refund or money back to somebody who purchased a product. All right, so that concludes our discussion of externalities and, positive and negative externalities. For more examples of these, make sure you go through the More Practice folders And actually just Googling positive externalities and negative externalities is going to give you a lot of examples as well. So good luck preparing for this quiz, and in the next lecture